The restaurant was the kind of place where power was measured by the firmness of a handshake and the price of a bottle of wine. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in soft golden light, and every table was occupied by men and women who had built their fortunes on sharp decisions and sharper instincts. Conversations hummed, laughter was measured, everything was controlled, predictable. Until the moment she walked in. The woman was plainly dressed, her posture hesitant, her hands gripping the small black clutch bag as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. The maitre d' glanced at her, eyes narrowing slightly before professionalism took over, and he gestured toward the private section where the evening's most important guests were gathered. At the far end of the room, seated among the city's wealthiest and most influential figures, was the host of the evening, Devant, the self-made millionaire. He was deep in conversation when he noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The subtle pauses, the quiet murmurs, the glances exchanged between his guests. When he followed their eyes, he saw her. The housekeeper. A moment of hesitation crossed his face, but then, he did something no one expected. He stood up. And he smiled. "Ah, you made it," he said warmly, extending a hand. The woman hesitated. The silence in the room was heavy, pressing against her like an invisible weight. Every gaze on her screamed one question: why is she here? Somewhere near the center of the table, a man leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Is this a joke?" The woman's fingers trembled as she shook Devant's hand, and for a brief second, she considered turning around and walking out. She had spent her entire life serving people like this. Cleaning their homes, scrubbing their kitchens, making sure their silverware gleamed under the very chandeliers they now sat beneath. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was sitting at the table. A sharply dressed woman, her necklace gleaming under the chandelier light, cleared her throat and forced a polite smile. "Devant, dear, I don't believe we've met your guest." It was a question disguised as a statement. Devant's smile never wavered. He placed a hand on the housekeeper's shoulder and turned to the expectant crowd. "This," he said, voice steady and deliberate, "is the most important guest of the evening." The room fell into stunned silence. The housekeeper swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their stares. Her heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to stand a little taller. And then, she spoke. Her words sent a shockwave through the table, one that left every single person in the room speechless. The silence that followed her words was thick, suffocating. Wine glasses were paused mid-air, forks hovering above expensive plates. Every set of eyes at the table, eyes that had seen billion-dollar deals and ruthless negotiations, were now fixed on one woman, the housekeeper. Devant, ever composed, let the silence linger. He had expected this. The sharply dressed woman who had questioned her presence earlier arched a perfectly manicured brow. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I caught that." The housekeeper, whose hands had been trembling a moment ago, exhaled. She had spent her life keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact, making herself invisible in places like this. But tonight, Devant had brought her here for a reason, and she wasn't going to waste this moment. She straightened her shoulders and repeated herself. "I said, thank you for having me. It's an honor." Simple words. But the way she said them, with a quiet dignity that was neither submissive nor desperate, shifted something in the room. It was the voice of someone who had seen things these people hadn't. Devant smiled approvingly. "Please, have a seat." She hesitated. The chair looked too expensive. The silverware too delicate. The people too polished. But then she thought of her son. She thought of all the nights she had spent scrubbing floors, all the early mornings when she had left home before sunrise, all the times she had been treated as if she were invisible. She sat down. The waiter, trained to read the room, hesitated only slightly before stepping forward and pouring her a glass of wine. She wrapped her fingers around the stem, feeling the coolness of the glass. Devant lifted his own. A toast. The guests lifted their glasses out of habit, though a few exchanged confused glances. "To the people we overlook," Devant said. "To those who work harder than we'll ever know. To the hands that build our homes, prepare our meals, and keep our lives running smoothly. Yet so rarely receive the respect they deserve. A few polite nods. A few murmured agreements. But the confusion lingered. Devon took a sip, and the guests followed. But the woman in the elegant dress, the one who had first questioned the housekeeper's presence, set her glass down and leaned forward. "This is quite the surprise, Devon," she said, tilting her head. "I must say, I've never seen you bring a guest like this before." There it was. The carefully veiled remark. The housekeeper felt her stomach tighten, but before she could say anything, Devon leaned back, relaxed as ever. "I never had the opportunity to bring someone like her before," he said. "And that's a shame, isn't it?" A few chuckles. A few polite smiles. But the discomfort in the air was undeniable. So, an older gentleman at the table interjected, clearly trying to shift the conversation, "What do you do?" The housekeeper knew what he was really asking. "Who are you, and why should we care?" She could have said the truth. That she cleaned houses. That she spent her days making sure floors gleamed and windows sparkled. That she had spent the past 5 years dusting the very office where Devon had built his empire. But instead, she smiled. "I solve problems," she said simply. A few surprised looks. "Oh," the older gentleman asked, clearly intrigued. "What kind of problems?" "The kind most people don't notice," she said. "Until it's too late." Now, she had their attention. Even Devon looked impressed. The housekeeper took a slow sip of her wine, just as the waiter began serving the first course. "I'm curious," another guest spoke up. "How do you know Devon?" She met Devon's gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was an encouraging glint in his eyes. The housekeeper set her glass down. "5 years ago, I started working in his office building," she said. "Not in one of the corner offices, not at the conference tables. I was the one who made sure those offices were spotless before the day began. The one who emptied the trash before any of you ever noticed it was full." A few of the guests shifted in their seats. She smiled slightly. "I saw things," she continued. "Not because I was spying. But because when people think you're invisible, they don't hide much." Devon chuckled. "That's an understatement." She turned to him. "Would you like to tell them? Or should I?" He gestured for her to continue, amusement dancing in his eyes. The housekeeper leaned forward. "I saw deals nearly fall apart because someone left confidential documents out overnight," she said. "I saw assistants in tears after being berated by their bosses. I saw opportunities being ignored because certain executives refused to listen to fresh ideas. And I saw Devon. Now, everyone was listening. He was different," she said. "I noticed that he greeted people by name. That he thanked the janitors, the security guards, the assistants. I watched him take notes by himself when others had assistants do it for them. And one night, I saw him stay back after hours to clean up a mess someone else had left behind, because he didn't believe it was beneath him." Devon gave a small, knowing smile. She turned back to the table. "I didn't just see dirt on the floors. I saw power. I saw the way some people wielded it like a weapon, and others like a tool. I saw who truly built the foundations of this company, and who simply took the credit." The room was silent. The housekeeper picked up her fork and took a bite of her meal as if she hadn't just dismantled their entire perception of power. The sharply dressed woman cleared her throat. "Well, I suppose perspective is important." The housekeeper smiled. "Yes. And sometimes, the best perspective comes from the people you never thought to ask." The older gentleman who had questioned her earlier leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "That's quite insightful." Devon lifted his glass again. To perspective, then. This time, when the guests lifted their glasses, the gesture was no longer polite. It was thoughtful. The housekeeper took another sip of wine, letting the moment settle. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was at the table. And they were listening. The air around the table had shifted. The whispers had faded, the condescending smirks had disappeared, and now there was something else in their expressions: curiosity. The housekeeper could feel it, see it in the way they were now watching her. She was no longer just a guest at their table. She was a puzzle they hadn't expected to solve. Devant, leaning back in his chair, was clearly amused. This was exactly why he had invited her. But he wasn't done yet. "Tell me," Devant said, swirling his wine glass lazily. "You said earlier that you solve problems people don't notice. I'd love to hear an example." The housekeeper hesitated, glancing around the table. There were at least a dozen powerful individuals sitting before her, the kind of people who could change someone's life with a single handshake. But then she reminded herself, they weren't the ones who had invited her. Devant had. And he had done it for a reason. So she took a breath and began. "There was an executive," she said, carefully placing her fork down. "A very important one. He had been at the company for years, long before I started working there. Everyone respected him. He was known for making big deals, bringing in profits, and being an absolute perfectionist. He had built a reputation for being untouchable." A few of the guests exchanged glances, as if trying to guess who she was referring to. "But he had a flaw," she continued, her voice steady. "A small one at first, something most people wouldn't even notice. But over time, it grew. He started getting careless. Leaving sensitive documents on his desk overnight, missing meetings, forgetting small but critical details in negotiations. People chalked it up to stress, maybe even arrogance. After all, when someone is that powerful, no one dares to question them." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I noticed." The room was silent. Even the servers had slowed their movements, listening in as they refilled glasses. The housekeeper leaned forward slightly. "One night, I was cleaning his office after hours. I saw a contract lying open on his desk, a contract that had the potential to make or break a major deal. But something about it seemed off. I had overheard a conversation about this deal the day before, and the numbers didn't match what was originally discussed." Devant raised a brow. "And what did you do?" The housekeeper smiled slightly. "I did what any good housekeeper would do. I cleaned." A few chuckles from the table. But Devant knew there was more. "I straightened the papers, stacked them neatly, and left them in plain sight. But I also left something else, an old newspaper clipping about a similar deal that had gone wrong years ago, one that had cost the company millions. I placed it right on top of the contract." Now, even the skeptics at the table were listening. The next morning, that executive found it. And he panicked. Because he realized he had almost made the exact same mistake. He corrected the error before the contract was finalized, and the company avoided a disaster that could have cost them millions. A pause. "I never told anyone," she finished. "Until now." There was a stunned silence. Finally, the sharply dressed woman spoke. "Wait, so you're telling us, you, a housekeeper, saved the company from a multi-million-dollar mistake?" The housekeeper shrugged. "I just did my job." A burst of laughter from Devant. "You did more than that," he said. "You saved someone's career, without them even knowing." The older gentleman, who had been skeptical before, nodded thoughtfully. "That's impressive." The housekeeper smiled. Devant set his glass down, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "And yet," he said, looking around the table, "no one here would have ever thought to ask her opinion. Why is that?" A few people shifted in their seats. The sharply dressed woman sighed, twirling her wine glass between her fingers. "Because she cleans floors, Devant. It's not exactly common practice to seek business advice from the cleaning staff." "And that," Devant said, "is exactly the problem." A ripple of discomfort went through the table. The housekeeper leaned back in her chair, feeling something strange, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. For years, she had been silent, an observer in the background. She had seen people like these guests make decisions that affected thousands, watched them celebrate victories and navigate failures. But for the first time, they were seeing her. And they were listening. The sharply dressed woman exhaled and gave the housekeeper a small smile, perhaps the first genuine one of the evening. "I'll admit," she said, "you're not what I expected." The housekeeper chuckled. Neither was this invitation. Devant grinned. "That's the beauty of it." The conversation slowly shifted back to business, but something had changed. The guests who had previously ignored her were now including her. They asked for her thoughts on certain topics, not out of politeness, but out of genuine curiosity. And the housekeeper, who had once believed her words held no value in rooms like this, realized something important: she had something to offer. By the end of the evening, she wasn't just another guest at the table. She was a voice worth listening to. As the dinner wound down, Devant turned to her. "You know," he said, "you've got more business sense than half the people I've worked with." She smiled. "I've had a lot of practice." Devant nodded. "Then maybe it's time you did something with it." The housekeeper blinked. "What do you mean?" He studied her for a moment. "Come by my office tomorrow," he said. "I have an idea." And just like that, with a simple invitation, her entire life was about to change. The night air was crisp as the housekeeper stepped outside the restaurant, her mind still spinning from everything that had happened. She had walked into that dinner feeling like an outsider, a woman out of place among people whose lives seemed untouchable. But now, something had shifted. She had held her own. She had spoken, and they had listened. And Devant had just offered her something she couldn't quite wrap her head around yet. "Come by my office tomorrow," he had said. Why? Her first instinct was to tell herself it was nothing, that he had just been making conversation. But Devant wasn't the type of man to say things he didn't mean. As she walked toward the car waiting to take her home, she let out a slow breath. Was she really ready for this? The next morning, she stood in front of the towering glass building she had cleaned for years. Except this time, she wasn't holding a mop or a dusting cloth. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She was here as a guest. As she stepped into the lobby, she felt a familiar mix of nerves and hesitation. The receptionist, a woman she had passed by countless times without ever exchanging more than a polite nod, looked up at her in surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone automatically polite but puzzled. The housekeeper cleared her throat. "I have a meeting with Mr. Devant." The receptionist's eyebrows lifted. "Oh. One moment." She quickly picked up the phone, her voice dropping into a hushed tone as she spoke to someone upstairs. Moments later, she looked up again, this time with a smile. "Mr. Devant will see you now. His assistant will escort you up." The housekeeper nodded, her palms suddenly damp as she followed the young assistant to the private elevator. She had been in this building thousands of times. She knew its hallways, its offices, even the hidden corners where staff would take short breaks between tasks. But she had never stepped foot into Devant's personal floor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a sleek, minimalist office space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And there, standing by his desk, was Devant. He turned with a grin. "Right on time." She stepped inside hesitantly. "I wasn't sure if you were serious last night," she admitted. He chuckled. "I never say things I don't mean." She glanced around. "So, why am I here?" Devant leaned against his desk, folding his arms. "Because I think you have something that most people in this building don't." She blinked. "And what's that?" "Perspective," he said simply. She frowned slightly. "Perspective?" He gestured toward the window. "Look out there." "What do you see?" She hesitated before stepping closer. The city stretched out beneath them, a bustling world of people moving like tiny specks in the grand design of things. I see buildings, she said slowly. Traffic. People going about their day. He nodded. And do you ever think about how different their experiences are? She turned to him, unsure where he was going with this. Of course. That's the problem, he said, pushing off the desk. Most people in power don't. They're so focused on their own world, their offices, their deals, their board meetings, that they forget what's happening at ground level. She crossed her arms. And you think I can change that? Devant smirked. I think you already have. She hesitated, feeling the weight of his words. I don't have a degree, Devant. I'm not a businesswoman. He raised a brow. A degree? Tell me, who at that dinner last night had a better understanding of the people who keep this company running, you or them? She didn't answer, but they both knew. Devant continued. You've been in rooms where people say things they wouldn't dare say in front of me. You've seen problems forming before they explode. You've prevented disasters without anyone realizing. And more importantly, you understand the people who are overlooked. She swallowed hard. And what exactly are you asking me to do? Devant picked up a folder from his desk and handed it to her. Consult, he said. Be my eyes and ears where others can't. Tell me what people won't say to my face. Help me fix problems before they become problems. She stared at the folder in her hands. A consulting position? The idea felt foreign, surreal. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. I've never done anything like this before. Devant smiled. You've been doing it for years. The only difference is now, you'll be getting paid for it. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. This is crazy. Maybe, he said. But the best ideas usually are. She looked down at the folder again, her mind racing. This wasn't just a job offer. This was a chance, a real chance, to do something different with her life. But it was terrifying. What if she failed? What if people didn't take her seriously? As if reading her thoughts, Devant spoke again. I know this is a big leap. You don't have to decide today. Take the weekend. Think about it. She nodded slowly, gripping the folder tighter. Okay. Devant smiled. Good. And no matter what you decide, just know, last night, you changed the way a lot of people think. That's not something everyone can do. She let his words settle as she walked out of the office, the folder still clutched in her hands. This was her moment. But was she brave enough to take it? The housekeeper, no, the former housekeeper, sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the folder in front of her. It was just a simple manila folder, but to her, it felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. Inside was a contract. An actual contract offering her a consulting position with Devant's company. A week ago, she had been scrubbing floors, wiping down desks, and making sure people like Devant and his colleagues never had to notice a speck of dust in their high-rise offices. And now? Now, she was being asked to sit at the same table as them. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the embossed logo on the top of the page. Was this real? Could she really do this? Her son walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. You're up early, he murmured sleepily, grabbing a glass of water. She gave him a small smile. Couldn't sleep. He glanced at the folder and frowned. What's that? She hesitated before sliding it toward him. A job offer. His eyebrows shot up. What kind of job? She exhaled. Consulting. His frown deepened. Wait. Since when do you consult? She chuckled, shaking her head. Since Devant decided I should. Her son's eyes widened. Devant? Like, your boss? The millionaire guy? She nodded. He grabbed the folder and skimmed through the first page. His mouth fell open. Mom, this is insane. He stopped, looking up at her. Are you gonna take it? She bit her lip. I don't know. Why not? She sighed, rubbing her temples. Because, what if I fail? Her son stared at her for a long moment before he shook his head. Mom. You've been running that place without even realizing it. You think those rich guys knew half of what was happening before you started pointing things out? She swallowed. But this is different. How? She gestured to the contract. This means stepping into a world I've never been a part of. A world where people have degrees and expensive suits and none of them have what you do, he interrupted. She blinked. You know people, Mom, he said. Not just numbers and contracts and board meetings. You know people, how they think, what they need, what they ignore. That's more valuable than any degree. She felt a lump rise in her throat. You really think I can do this? He smirked. I think you already have. She stared at the contract again. The doubt was still there, whispering in the back of her mind. But now, there was something else. Hope. The next morning, she stood outside Devant's office, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Devant looked up from his desk and grinned. I was starting to think you wouldn't show. She walked forward, placing the signed contract on his desk. I hope you don't regret this. His grin widened. I never regret good decisions. She exhaled. So, what now? Devant leaned back in his chair, studying her. Now, we get to work. She hesitated. What exactly do you want me to do? He tapped his fingers on the desk. For now? Just observe. Watch. Learn. Tell me what you see. No pressure, no big decisions, just use the instincts that got you here in the first place. She nodded slowly. That, she could do. Her first official day as a consultant felt surreal. She walked through the halls of the company building, the same hall she had cleaned for years. But now, she wasn't invisible. Now, people noticed her. Some employees greeted her politely, though with obvious curiosity. Others gave her confused glances, as if wondering why a woman they had once seen pushing a cleaning cart was now walking confidently into executive meetings. She wasn't sure how she felt about that yet. Her first assignment was simple, or at least, it seemed simple. Devant handed her a list of department heads and asked her to observe how they worked. No official interviews, no reports, just watch, listen, and learn. And so, she did. She spent her first week moving through the company, watching everything from how managers spoke to their teams to how employees responded to pressure. She saw things others didn't. She saw the assistant who always seemed exhausted, constantly fixing her boss's mistakes without credit. She saw the department head who held long meetings that accomplished nothing while his team scrambled to meet deadlines. She saw the quiet employee in the corner who had brilliant ideas but never spoke up. And she took notes. At the end of the week, she walked into Devant's office and handed him a single sheet of paper. What's this? He asked, scanning it. A list, she said simply. Of all the problems people pretend don't exist. Devant raised an eyebrow, reading through the names and notes she had jotted down. A slow smile spread across his face. You really are something else. She crossed her arms. So what now? Devant leaned forward. Now, we start fixing things. Word spread fast. Whispers moved through the building, about the woman Devant had brought in, about how she saw things others didn't, about how she was changing things. Not everyone was happy. Some executives felt threatened. Others dismissed her, convinced she wouldn't last. But they underestimated her. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just watching from the sidelines. She was making a difference. And she wasn't going anywhere. The murmurs had started small, quiet conversations in the break rooms, hushed discussions in hallways, stolen glances in meetings. At first, no one knew exactly what to make of the housekeeper turned consultant. Some employees were simply curious. Others were skeptical. A few were outright dismissive. "She used to clean floors," one senior executive scoffed. "And now she's telling us how to run things?" But then, things started to change. Small things, at first. Meetings became shorter and more efficient. Teams that had been constantly stressed and overworked suddenly found their schedules balanced. A few employees who had always been overlooked were now being asked for their input. And people started realizing something surprising: she was right. One afternoon, as she walked through the office, she overheard two employees talking near the break room. "Have you noticed the difference lately?" one asked. "Like, things actually feel better?" The other nodded. "Yeah. I heard it's because of her." She didn't stop to listen any longer, but a small smile played at her lips. Change was happening. But not everyone was happy about it. Devant had warned her. "There are people who don't like change," he had said. "Especially when it comes from someone they never expected." She had brushed it off at first. She had dealt with worse in her life. What could they possibly say or do to affect her now? She was about to find out. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an email. It arrived late at night, long after she had left the office. Anonymous sender. The subject line read, "Stay in your place." Her stomach twisted as she opened it. The message was short, almost clinical. "You don't belong here. You don't deserve this job. No one will take you seriously. Walk away before you embarrass yourself." She stared at the words, her hands tightening into fists. It wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like she didn't belong. But it was the first time someone had gone out of their way to remind her. She closed her laptop and took a deep breath. Was she really going to let a coward hiding behind an anonymous email shake her confidence? No. She had worked too hard for this. She wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, as she entered the office, she could feel the weight of the stares. Some were friendly, some were uncertain, and a few were downright hostile. She kept her head high and walked straight to Devant's office. When she stepped inside, he was already looking at his computer, a deep frown on his face. "I saw the email," he said, before she could even speak. She exhaled. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smirked. "Good." She sat down across from him. "Do you have any idea who sent it?" He leaned back in his chair. "I have a few guesses. But I don't think it matters." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the real question is, why did they send it?" She hesitated. "Because they don't think I belong." Devant shook his head. "Because they're scared." She blinked. "Scared?" He nodded. People don't attack someone who isn't a threat. They only push back when they feel like they're losing control. "And right now? You're making waves." She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "So what do I do?" Devant grinned. "You keep making waves." The pushback didn't stop. Some executives tried to dismiss her suggestions. Others acted as if she wasn't even in the room during meetings. But every time they tried to shut her out, she found a way back in. She kept observing. Kept listening. Kept learning. And soon, her influence became undeniable. One afternoon, Devant called her into a high-level meeting. A major contract negotiation was on the table, one that could affect hundreds of employees. She had spent weeks studying the team responsible for handling it. She knew their strengths, their weaknesses, the way they worked under pressure. And she knew there was a problem. A problem no one else had noticed. Halfway through the meeting, she cleared her throat. "I think we're missing something." The room fell silent. One of the senior executives sighed, clearly annoyed. "With all due respect, I think we have everything under control." She didn't flinch. "I'm sure you do." But if we move forward with this contract the way it's written, we're going to have a major employee retention issue. Devant raised an eyebrow. Explain. She turned to the team. This contract looks great on paper. But the new policies you're proposing? They're going to drive employees away. The workload expectations are unrealistic, and you haven't factored in the burnout rate. You're looking at this from a numbers perspective, but you're forgetting the human side of it. One of the executives scoffed. That's speculation. She smiled. Actually, it's data. She reached into her folder and pulled out a report. I spent the last 2 weeks gathering employee feedback. Anonymous surveys, casual conversations, even observing break room discussions. And the message is clear: if these policies go through, we're going to lose some of our best talent. She slid the report across the table. The executives glanced at each other. Devant picked up the report and skimmed through it. Then, slowly, he nodded. She's right, he said. We need to adjust the contract. The executive who had dismissed her earlier looked like he had swallowed a lemon. She had one. By the end of the month, the company had not only secured the contract, but they had also improved their policies, creating a healthier work environment for employees. And suddenly, the whispers around the office had changed. The skepticism was still there, but now, there was respect. People who had once ignored her were now coming to her for advice. Executives who had rolled their eyes at her were starting to listen. And the anonymous threats? They stopped. Because now, it was clear, she wasn't going anywhere. She had fought for her place at the table. And she had earned it. As she walked through the office one evening, Devant fell into step beside her. You did good today, he said. She smirked. I know. He chuckled. Still nervous about being here? She exhaled, looking around. No, she said. Not anymore. Devant nodded. Good. Because this is just the beginning. She smiled. And for the first time in her life, she believed it, the transformation was undeniable. What had once been a job she hesitated to accept had now become something she owned. She walked through the office halls, no longer the invisible woman who swept through unnoticed. People acknowledged her, some with respect, some with curiosity, and a few with lingering resentment. But none could deny one thing: she belonged here. Her influence was growing, not because of power or a title, but because she understood something most executives never did. People. She knew the silent struggles employees faced, the pressure managers ignored, the unspoken frustrations that could cause a company to crumble from within. And now, people were listening. But just as she was finding her rhythm, a new challenge surfaced, one that threatened to undo everything she had worked for. Devant called her into his office one afternoon, his usual relaxed demeanor absent. He was staring at his computer screen, fingers steepled beneath his chin. She sat across from him, instantly on alert. What's wrong? She asked. He exhaled sharply. We have a problem. She leaned forward. What kind of problem? He turned the screen toward her. It was an internal report, one filled with financial projections, risk assessments, and employee data. But one section stood out. Layoffs. She felt her stomach tighten. This can't be right. Devant rubbed his temples. The board is considering it. They're saying we need to streamline operations to increase profitability. She clenched her fists. That's corporate speak for cut jobs to boost the bottom line. He nodded grimly. She shook her head. This isn't necessary. We've been making progress. Employee morale is the highest it's been in years. If they go through with this, it'll destroy everything we've built. I know, Devant said. That's why I'm telling you. She frowned. Why me? He gave her a pointed look. Because you're the only person in this company who can convince them otherwise. The boardroom felt colder than usual. She had been in this room before, but today, there was an edge to the atmosphere. Seated around the massive table were the company's highest-ranking executives, the people who controlled salaries, policies, and, ultimately, people's livelihoods. Devant sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. She took a deep breath and began. "I know why we're here," she said, keeping her voice steady. "You're considering layoffs to cut costs. But I'm here to tell you, you're making a mistake." One of the board members sighed. "Look, we understand you've been making some positive changes, but at the end of the day, this is a business." She nodded. "Exactly. And as a business, your greatest asset isn't your stock price or your quarterly reports, it's your people." Some of them looked unimpressed. Others leaned in slightly, curious. She continued. "I spent the last 3 months fixing the problems you didn't see. I talked to employees, I studied the workflow, I found inefficiencies in places you never thought to look. And here's the truth, we don't have a hiring problem. We have a leadership problem." A few murmurs passed through the room. Devant smirked, but he stayed silent, letting her work. She tapped the stack of reports in front of her. "You're suggesting we lay off employees when the real issue is mismanagement. Departments are understaffed, communication is broken, and people are being pushed to their limits without proper resources. You think cutting jobs will fix this? It won't. It will only make it worse." An older board member frowned. "You're telling us we're running the company incorrectly?" She met his gaze, without flinching. "I'm telling you that the people making these decisions aren't the ones on the ground dealing with the consequences." Silence. She let it stretch, let them sit with the weight of her words. Then, she flipped to the last page of her report. "There's another way," she said. Devant leaned forward. "I'm listening." She pointed to the numbers. "Instead of cutting jobs, restructure the workflow. Identify which departments are overburdened and move resources accordingly. Implement better training programs to improve efficiency. And most importantly, invest in the people you already have, instead of replacing them with cheaper hires." The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't out of dismissal. They were considering it. One of the board members cleared his throat. "These are bold suggestions." She shrugged. "So was hiring me. And yet, here we are." Devant chuckled at that, his eyes gleaming with pride. The older board member finally sighed. "We'll review your proposal. No decisions will be made today." She exhaled. "That's all I ask." As the meeting adjourned, Devant clapped her on the back. "You just went toe-to-toe with a room full of sharks," he said, grinning. "How do you feel?" She let out a shaky breath. "Like I need a drink." He laughed. "Come on. You earned it." A week later, the decision came in. No layoffs. Instead, they approved her plan for restructuring. And for the first time, the employees, the real people who made the company run, had a reason to believe in their leadership again. She had done it. She had saved their jobs. She had proved that change was possible. But more importantly, she had proved that she belonged here. And there was no going back. The atmosphere in the office had changed. Where once there had been uncertainty, now there was trust. Employees weren't just whispering about her anymore, they were coming to her directly. They wanted her opinion, her advice. They wanted her to be the voice they never had before. She had become more than a consultant. She was the bridge between the workers and the executives, the only person who understood both sides. And Devant? He had never looked prouder. But with every step forward, she knew there would be pushback. She just didn't expect it to come from him. It started with a conversation in Devant's office. She had walked in like usual, a new proposal in hand, ready to go over some adjustments for employee development programs. But the moment she saw the look on his face, she knew something was wrong. His usual easygoing smirk was missing. Instead, his jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against the desk. She sat down cautiously. Okay. What's going on? Devant let out a slow breath. The board called me this morning. Her stomach tightened. And? He sighed, rubbing his temples. They're concerned. She frowned. Concerned about what? He looked at her carefully. About you. She felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean? They think you're gaining too much influence. She blinked. Too much influence? Devant leaned forward. You've changed everything in the past few months. Employees trust you. They listen to you. Some of them come to you before they come to their own managers. And to the board? That's dangerous. She crossed her arms. Dangerous? I'm literally making this company better. I know that, he said. You know that. But the board? They don't see it that way. They think you're disrupting the chain of command. She scoffed. You mean they don't like that I'm holding people accountable? Devant smirked. Bingo. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. So what? Are they firing me? His expression darkened. Not yet. But they want you to scale back. Scale back, she repeated. They don't want you directly engaging with employees as much, he said carefully. They want you to stick to reports and recommendations, not actual involvement. She stared at him. They want me to be silent. Devant didn't answer. He didn't have to. She leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. They were trying to shut her down. After everything she had done, after proving herself over and over again, they still saw her as a threat. She should have expected it. But it still hurt. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the conversation with Devant in her mind, feeling the anger simmer beneath her skin. They wanted her to stop. To stay in her lane. To go back to being the invisible woman in the background. No. She had worked too hard for this. She had fought for her place at the table, earned her seat. And she wasn't about to let them take it away. She needed a plan. The next morning, she walked into Devant's office, before he even had a chance to call her. He looked up in surprise. You're early. She dropped a folder onto his desk. I'm not backing down. His eyebrows lifted. I figured as much. She crossed her arms. They want me to scale back? Fine. I'll do it, on paper. Devant smirked. Go on. She gestured to the folder. I'll stop speaking directly with employees, but only if they start listening to my recommendations. No more suggestions they can ignore. If they want me out of direct engagement, then they need to implement actual changes. Devant flipped through the folder, nodding slowly. You're forcing their hand. She nodded. If they refuse, it proves they never wanted real change in the first place. He grinned. You're playing chess now. She smirked. I learned from the best. Devant chuckled, shaking his head. All right. I'll take this to the board. She exhaled. And if they reject it? His smile faded slightly. Then we fight back. Days passed before she got an answer. And when she finally did, it wasn't from Devant. It was from the board themselves. She was summoned to a private meeting, one with the most powerful figures in the company. She knew what this was. A test. They wanted to see if she would break under pressure. She wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The meeting room was colder than she expected. 11 board members sat before her, their expressions unreadable. The chairman, a stern-looking man with silver hair, folded his hands on the table. You've caused quite a stir in this company, he said. She kept her posture steady. I believe I've made things better. He arched a brow. That depends on who you ask. She clenched her fists beneath the table. You didn't bring me here to ask anything. You already made up your minds. One of the other board members sighed. Let's be honest. You've overstepped. She met his gaze head-on. I did what no one else had the courage to do. Silence. The chairman tapped his fingers against the table. Tell me. Why should we keep you here? She took a breath. Then, she looked around the table. At that business dinner months ago, you all whispered about me, she said. You saw me and thought I didn't belong. Some of you probably still think that. A few members shifted uncomfortably. But here's the thing, she continued. I do belong. And you know it. She leaned forward. Under my recommendations, productivity has increased by 20%. Employee retention has improved. Efficiency is at an all-time high. And for the first time, employees actually trust this company. She tilted her head. But sure. Let's talk about how I'm the problem. Silence. She saw the way some of them exchanged glances, knowing she was right. The chairman sighed. We can't ignore your impact. But we also can't let you continue operating unchecked. She nodded. Then give me real authority. Make it official. A few board members frowned. She continued. You want me to scale back? Fine. I won't engage as much. But in exchange, you implement every one of my recommendations. No more suggestions, just action. More silence. Then, finally, the chairman leaned back in his chair. You drive a hard bargain. She smiled. I learned from Devant. A few chuckles. Then, the chairman nodded. Fine, he said. We'll agree, to some conditions. She smirked. That's all I need. She had one. When she walked out of that meeting, Devant was waiting. Well, he asked. She grinned. I'm still here. He chuckled. Of course you are. She exhaled, feeling the weight of the battle lift from her shoulders. She had faced down the board, and won. She had proved herself, not just to them, but to herself. And now? Now, she was unstoppable. The weight of the meeting still lingered in her chest as she stepped out onto the balcony outside Devant's office. The air was crisp, carrying the distant sounds of the city below, honking cars, distant chatter, the heartbeat of a world she had spent most of her life merely serving. Now? Now, she was part of it. She wasn't just someone who cleaned up after success, she was someone who created it. Devant stepped beside her, arms crossed, a small smirk playing on his lips. How does it feel? She let out a slow breath. Like I just walked through fire. He chuckled. Yeah. Board meetings tend to have that effect. She turned to him. But I won, didn't I? His smirk widened. You did. She exhaled. So. What now? Devant leaned against the railing. Now? You work. You take everything you've fought for and actually make it mean something. She swallowed. And if they try to push back again? Devant's eyes glinted. Then we push harder. For the first time since stepping into this world, she truly believed she could do it. She had always been strong. She had always been smart. But now, she was fearless. Over the next few months, she transformed the company. Policies changed. Employees who had once been overworked and ignored were now thriving. A new mentorship program was put in place, one that bridged the gap between executives and lower-level employees. It forced the people at the top to truly see the workers beneath them. And the results? Profits increased, not from layoffs, but from productivity and innovation. The company was running better than ever. And her influence? It wasn't just tolerated anymore. It was respected. One evening, she found herself in the same restaurant where her journey had started, the same high-end place where she had once felt so out of place. But this time, she wasn't the awkward guest in borrowed clothes, clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. This time, she was here on her terms. As she sat at a reserved table, sipping her wine, she noticed a familiar face approaching. It was the sharply dressed woman from that very first dinner, the one who had questioned her presence, the one who had dismissed her with polite condescension. But now, there was something different in her expression. Respect. The woman hesitated for only a second before offering a small smile. Mind if I join you? She raised an eyebrow. That depends. Are you going to ask me what I'm doing here again? A chuckle. No, the woman said, sitting down. I think we both know you belong here now. She smiled. It had taken time. It had taken battles. But she had earned this seat. And no one could ever take it from her again. Weeks later, Devant called her into his office for an unexpected meeting. She walked in, expecting another strategy discussion, another policy change. But instead, he handed her an envelope. She frowned. What's this? Devant smirked. Open it. She did. And her breath caught. It wasn't a report. It wasn't a proposal. It was a contract. Her own contract. She looked up in shock. Is this? Devant nodded. It's time. Her pulse raced. You're offering me a permanent position, he finished. Not just as a consultant. As an executive. Her heart pounded. Devant, he leaned back, watching her. You earned this. Every single bit of it. You fought for it. And now, I want you by my side, for real this time. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. This was everything she had fought for. Not just the title. Not just the office. But the validation, the undeniable proof that she was more than just a former housekeeper. She was a leader. She exhaled shakily. Are you sure about this? Devant grinned. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She looked down at the contract. Then, she reached for the pen. With a steady hand, she signed her name. And just like that, she sealed her place in history. A year later, she stood at the front of a massive conference hall, looking out at a room full of executives, managers, and employees. People from every level of the company were here, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. And now? Now, it was normal. She cleared her throat and adjusted the microphone. When I started at this company, I wasn't sitting in a room like this, she began. I was in the background, unnoticed, unheard. The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. But what I learned, what I proved, is that power doesn't come from titles or wealth. She let that sit for a moment. Power comes from understanding. From listening. From seeing the things that no one else sees. Devant stood at the back of the room, watching her with a proud grin. She smiled. And if there's one lesson I want you all to take from my journey, it's this: never underestimate the people you overlook. She paused, then added, because one day, they might be the ones running the show. The crowd erupted into applause. She stepped back from the podium, heart pounding. This was her moment. And she had earned every single second of it. Life lesson: success isn't about where you start, it's about where you refuse to stop. She had once been dismissed as just a housekeeper. Now, she was the woman who changed everything. And the best part? She was just getting started.